Have you ever felt like a house could be waiting for you, as if it remembered you? I'm not talking about simple nostalgia, but something deeper, something darker, something that breathes through the walls and murmurs from the corners. Let me warn you, this story is not for the faint of heart. My name is Richard. I'm 61 years old, and I still carry the burden of what we experienced that time. After many years struggling through poorly paid jobs in Asheville, I finally believed we could catch a break. But life had a different plan for us. When my mother, Mrs. Carroll, passed away under circumstances that no one could clearly explain, we were forced to leave our small apartment in Cincinnati and move into the old family house deep in the hills near Blue Ridge. The house had been deserted for years, sitting in a place where the fog never seemed to lift and the wind carried whispers you didn't want to hear. From the moment we crossed the rusted iron gate, I felt a weight settle in my chest, a silent warning that we were stepping into forbidden ground. The mansion was massive, built nearly 100 years ago, with endless hallways stretching into darkness. The high ceilings groaned under every gust of wind, and the air was heavy with the mix of dampness and stale incense. Sarah, my wife, tried to keep a positive attitude, believing that it was just a matter of time before we turned that cold shell into a real home. Jacob, our 8-year-old boy, stayed close by, mostly silent, as if he too sensed something was terribly wrong. That first night was the hardest. It felt like the walls swallowed every word we spoke. Every footstep echoed unnervingly, as if someone else was trailing behind us. As we settled into what used to be my mother's bedroom, I found an old doll in the closet, its dress torn and its glass eyes shattered. I didn't show it to Sarah. I simply tossed it into a corner of the attic, trying not to think about what it could mean. Despite the unease, we tried to convince ourselves it was normal. Old houses creak, strange sounds happen, tired minds play tricks. But when Jacob asked that night, voice trembling, "Dad, who's the lady waving at me from the stairs?" I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. That was the first undeniable sign that we had made a terrible mistake. Before we continue, if you enjoy chilling stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. You won't want to miss what's coming, because trust me, this is only the beginning. The first few days in the house were a blend of cautious hope and silent fear. We tried to settle into the new life, clearing layers of dust, patching up broken windows, doing anything to make the place feel like home. But from the very beginning, Jacob started behaving oddly. One afternoon, while Sarah swept the main hallway, I heard Jacob talking to himself in the living room. It wasn't the usual babbling of a child lost in his imagination. It sounded like a full conversation, as if someone unseen was replying. I crept closer and heard him say clearly, "No, Grandma, I don't want to go down there." I froze. Grandma? Jacob had barely any memories of Mrs. Carroll. He only knew her from faded photographs. When I asked who he was talking to, he simply smiled shyly and said, "To the lady who lives here, Dad. She says she'll take care of us." That night, after putting Jacob to bed, Sarah and I sat whispering in the kitchen, trying to convince ourselves it was just the stress, the move, the new surroundings, the old spooky house. But deep down, we both knew something wasn't right. The whispers started coming more often. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, we would hear soft footsteps upstairs, even though no one slept there. Doors creaked open by themselves, pushed by unseen hands. Windows would swing wide even though we had bolted them tightly. One night, as I fought to fall asleep, I saw Jacob standing motionless beside our bed. His eyes were wide open but lifeless, and he murmured words under his breath. I couldn't catch everything, but one sentence burned into my mind. "She wants us to stay forever." I jolted up immediately and carried him back to his room. Sarah barely woke, but saw the worry etched on my face. That night, we left every light in the house on. The next morning, I sat Jacob down to talk seriously. I asked him who the lady was. With all the innocent honesty in the world, he described an elderly woman wearing a long burgundy dress and an old-fashioned hat. What froze my blood was when he said she smelled like frankincense, the same scent Mrs. Carroll used during Day of the Dead celebrations. Sarah tried to find logical explanations. Maybe it was a patchwork of memories, pieced together from old pictures or forgotten stories. But deep inside, doubt gnawed at me. What if we hadn't just moved into a house? What if we had awakened something that had been waiting? From that moment on, I began to pay closer attention. Every shadow, every groan of the floorboards, every shiver down my spine, I knew none of it was coincidence. And what we discovered after that was far worse. With each sunrise, the atmosphere in the house grew denser, heavier, as if something unseen was thickening the very air. We tried to hold on to our routines, pretending everything was normal. Sarah spent her mornings scrubbing and organizing, while I patched cracks in the walls and nailed shut windows that mysteriously opened every night. One afternoon, while Sarah cleaned the master bathroom, I heard her let out a strangled scream. I ran to find her frozen in front of the antique mirror above the sink, her face pale as wax. She pointed at the glass. There, as clear as day, a shadowy silhouette stood behind her. I rushed to her side, but in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. We tried to brush it off as a trick of the light, a play of dust and reflections, but after that day, the mirrors all across the house began to act strangely. Often, when passing by, we would catch glimpses out of the corners of our eyes, a hand resting on a frame, a face that wasn't ours staring back for a split second. The most horrifying night was when, closing our bedroom door, I caught sight of my own reflection in the mirror. Only it didn't move when I did. I blinked. It didn't. I tried to explain it away. Exhaustion, stress, old childhood fears stirring back up. But how could I dismiss what Sarah was seeing too? Or what Jacob was seeing? One evening, while playing in the living room, Jacob stopped in front of the grand mirror in the entrance hall. He stood there, completely still, mesmerized. When we called his name, he didn't answer. As we got closer, we saw it. Next to him in the mirror, the figure of a hunched old woman in black with a vintage hat, the same lady he had described before. But when we turned toward the mirror, there was no one there, only Jacob, trembling. That night, we covered every mirror in the house with white sheets. We didn't know if it would help, but something told us we needed to cut off whatever connection this presence was using to reach us. As we draped the last sheet over the mirror in the main hall, Jacob looked up at us and whispered, "She says she doesn't want to be covered. She's going to be angry." My hands shook as I tucked in the fabric. Deep in my gut, I knew we had crossed a line we could never uncross, and that it might already be too late. Whatever lurked in that house was only beginning to show itself. After covering the mirrors, the house seemed to settle for a few days. There were no strange noises, no unsettling reflections. Sarah and I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, the worst had passed. But we couldn't have been more wrong. One night, close to midnight, a faint sound woke me. A soft, dragging moan drifting down the hallway. I sat up, straining to hear. Sarah stirred too, fear wide in her eyes. We stared at each other, saying nothing, but we both felt the same icy terror creeping under our skin. When I switched on the bedside lamp, we saw Jacob standing at the doorway of our bedroom. In his small hands, he clutched a kitchen knife, his expression hollow, as if someone else were controlling him. "She says I have to protect the house," he murmured in a rough voice, sounding nothing like the child we knew. Sarah gasped, and I sprang from the bed. I approached carefully, arms outstretched, speaking softly to avoid startling him further. Jacob seemed completely entranced. When I reached to take the knife, his face twisted into an angry snarl I had never seen before. Quickly, I managed to wrestle the knife from his grip. It clattered to the ground, the sound cutting through the heavy silence of the house. Jacob immediately broke down into sobs, as if he had just awakened from a nightmare he couldn't remember. We embraced him tightly, trying to comfort him, though our own fear threatened to suffocate us. The next morning, we knew we had to act. We sealed off the old bedroom that had once belonged to Mrs. Carroll, nailing planks across the door in a desperate attempt to block whatever force was trying to manifest. It felt childish, almost pathetic, but we had to do something, anything, to protect ourselves. That same afternoon, as I hammered the final board into place, a freezing gust swept through the hallway, carrying with it a faint whisper, "You won't escape." My heart froze mid-beat. I understood then that we were dealing with something far more powerful, far more ancient and dangerous than we had ever imagined. What we didn't realize was that sealing that room wouldn't stop the darkness. It would only make it more impatient. Before I go on, I want to invite you. Tap the yellow lamp icon and stay with us as we uncover disturbing mysteries together. Believe me, what's coming will shake you to your core. The following days passed in a tense, suffocating calm. The house was so oppressively silent that at times it felt like even breathing was forbidden. Jacob, though quieter, refused to go near the hallway where we had sealed the door, and Sarah barely slept, constantly alert to any sound. One morning, while fixing a crack in the living room floor, my hammer struck something odd. It wasn't the solid thunk of wood. It was hollow, a different resonance altogether. Curiosity overpowered my caution, and I peeled back an old dusty rug to reveal a nearly invisible trapdoor. My heart raced. Every instinct screamed not to open it, but a need to understand, or maybe something deeper, pushed me on. I pried open the heavy hatch, and a sour, ancient stench rushed up to choke me. Beneath the trapdoor, a narrow staircase of rotten wood led downward into utter blackness. Gripping a flashlight that barely pierced the gloom, I descended carefully. With each step, the air grew colder, heavier, like I was sinking into a living thing. The basement was small, its walls covered in bizarre symbols painted in deep red and black. In one corner, handmade dolls sat in a pile, their eyes torn out, their bodies tied with black ribbons. On a battered wooden table, melted candles, dried herbs, and a crumbling old notebook lay scattered. The notebook was written in broken English, sprinkled with words from long-forgotten indigenous languages. As I flipped it open, the brittle pages resisted, groaning under my touch. Through smudged lines I made out chilling phrases, invocations, rituals to trap souls, pacts with ancient entities. My mother's name, Carol, appeared repeatedly, tied to ceremonies performed under new moons, asking for eternal protection of her bloodline. A chill ran through me. She hadn't just been a bitter woman. My mother had dabbled in something far darker, blending old native rites with black magic. The house wasn't simply a family inheritance, it was a shrine, a place consecrated to maintain bonds with whatever she had called forth. Suddenly, a thud sounded behind me. I spun around, but saw nothing, though I could feel something, someone, getting closer, the basement itself pressing inward. I fled, scrambling up the stairs, slamming the hatch shut and piling anything I could find on top of it. When I rejoined Sarah and Jacob, I pretended everything was normal. They couldn't see the terror twisting inside me, but I knew we had crossed into something far worse than a simple haunting, and the worst of it hadn't even begun yet. After discovering the basement, things in the house grew even more unsettling. Jacob, once so lively, began to wither before our eyes. He stopped playing with his toys, stopped asking for bedtime stories. He spent hours staring out the window at the thick forest surrounding the house, whispering words in a language neither of us understood. Sarah tried over and over to draw him out, but he would only reply with short, clipped answers, as if an invisible wall had risen between us. One afternoon, as I sifted through papers in the kitchen, I heard faint scratching sounds from the living room. I crept closer and froze. Jacob was scribbling on the walls, but these weren't childish doodles. They were intricate symbols, horrifyingly similar to the ones in the basement, and worse still, He was drawing them with blood seeping from tiny cuts on his fingers. I ran to him, wrapping him tightly in my arms, trying not to break down into tears. Jacob looked up at me with eyes that were no longer a child's. Dark, hollow, endless. "She told me I had to," he whispered. "She said, it'll keep us safe." That night, Sarah and I didn't sleep at all. Fear had entrenched itself in our home. Jacob murmured in his sleep, broken phrases in ancient dialects, prayers from some forgotten ritual. Around 3 a.m, a loud bang echoed from the hallway. I raced from our bedroom and my blood turned to ice. Every door in the house had swung wide open, letting in the freezing forest air. At the far end of the hallway, the trapdoor to the basement gaped open once more, despite everything I had done to seal it. And standing beside it was Jacob, fully awake, smiling with a calmness that was terrifying. "Grandma says it's almost time," he said softly. I edged toward him slowly, terrified of provoking something worse. Sarah rushed behind me, tears streaming down her face. We grabbed Jacob and slammed the hatch shut, chaining it this time, but deep down we knew it wouldn't be enough. The presence in that house, whether it was Mrs. Carroll or something far worse, had found a doorway through our son. And the sickening certainty gnawed at me. The nightmare was just beginning. That very night, as we struggled to find even a scrap of rest, the house itself seemed to change. The walls almost seemed to breathe, trembling under unseen weight. It started with a faint trembling, making the glasses on the table jitter. Then came a deafening pound on the front door, strong enough to shake the frame. Jacob, sleeping between us, opened his eyes, not with fear, but anticipation. I leapt up, flipping on every light in the house, but the bulbs flickered, dimming ominously. Sarah clutched Jacob tightly against her chest, trembling. Suddenly, the walls began to weep. It wasn't water, it was thick, blackish liquid, smelling metallic and wrong, seeping down the walls in grotesque shapes. I shouted for Sarah to run to the kitchen, the only room without large windows. As they fled, I saw something that rooted me in place. From cracks in the ceiling, long black hands unfurled, reaching blindly, hungrily. I tore myself free and sprinted after them, but the house fought back. Furniture moved on its own, chairs sliding to block doorways, doors slamming shut with violent force. My mind reeled in panic, but one thought kept me moving. I had to get my family out. I reached the kitchen, where Sarah crouched in a corner, cradling Jacob. The lights blinked out completely, plunging us into total darkness. Only the faint beam of my flashlight kept the night at bay. At that moment, we heard it. Slow, dragging footsteps descending the stairs. I aimed the flashlight toward the hallway, and for a fleeting moment we saw her, an old woman dressed in black, her face hidden by a veil, walking straight toward us. Sarah let out a broken sob. Jacob, his voice flat and lifeless, said, "Grandma's coming to get us." Panic surged through me. We had to leave immediately. I grabbed Sarah's hand, scooped Jacob into my arms, and we dodged around, crashing furniture and shifting shadows, racing for the back door. But just as we reached it, it slammed shut violently, as if the house itself were trying to trap us inside. Fighting through the terror, freezing my limbs, I fumbled for the keys, struggling with the lock, as the footsteps pounded closer and closer, like a death march in our ears. Finally, the door gave way. A blast of icy wind nearly tore us from the threshold, invisible fingers clawing at our clothes and skin, desperate to pull us back. But it wasn't our time. Not yet. We stumbled out into a torrential downpour, the rain hammering us mercilessly as if nature itself sought to stop us. Sarah slipped on the stairs, but I caught her, clutching Jacob tightly to my chest. Behind us, the house moaned like a wounded beast. Every window seemed an eye glaring at us, every door slamming shut like furious roars. We didn't look back, we just ran, feet sinking into the growing mud, the howling wind shrieking around us like a chorus of mourning. The trees lining the property thrashed violently, their branches like twisted hands reaching out to grab us. Every step we took, I felt something unseen brush against us, as if invisible threads were trying to pull us back toward that cursed house. Our clothes were soaked, the water weighing us down, but adrenaline kept us moving. Sarah sobbed as she stumbled alongside me, slipping again and again, only to pick herself up with a strength born of sheer survival. And survival was exactly what was at stake. At last, we spotted the faint glow of headlights from the main road. With every foot we put between ourselves and that house, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift, as if an enormous shadow was losing its grip on us. When we reached the road, an old delivery truck was trundling by, and we waved our arms frantically to get the driver's attention. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, opened the door without asking many questions. We climbed in without looking back, and only once the truck rumbled away did I allow myself to turn and glance toward the house. Through the veil of rain, the dark silhouette of the house stood undisturbed. But there, in one of the upstairs windows, unmistakable even at that distance, was the figure of the old woman, standing still, watching us. My stomach twisted into a knot. She wasn't following us physically, but I knew, with a horrible certainty, that she would not let us go easily. We arrived in Monroe just before dawn. Sarah shivered from exhaustion and cold, and Jacob clung to me tightly, still murmuring strange words in that ancient tongue. We rushed him to the nearest hospital, making up a story about a household accident to avoid uncomfortable questions. While the doctors treated some minor cuts on Jacob's hands, I couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at me. We had escaped the house, but had we really escaped it? Deep down I could feel it, and the presence, like a dark fingerprint pressed onto our souls, invisible but alive. And the worst part was knowing that this was only the beginning of a silent pursuit. After getting Jacob stabilized and ensuring there were no serious injuries, Sarah and I knew we needed answers. We couldn't just run away and pretend nothing had happened. Something, or someone, had tried to anchor us to that house, and we needed to understand why. I started digging through old family documents that Mrs. Carroll had stored years ago in a wooden chest, which my cousin Stephen had moved to a storage unit in a small town near Asheville. Among dusty files, sepia-toned photographs, and crumbling letters, I found what appeared to be my mother's youthful diary. At first it was innocent, recollections of childhood on a tiny farm in rural Virginia, stories of vibrant markets, colorful festivals, and family traditions. But as I read further, the tone darkened. Mrs. Carroll wrote about her fascination with ancient forces, about how she had been drawn into a circle of older women who practiced rituals blending traditional herbalism with long-forgotten indigenous prayers. Later entries became chillingly explicit. Ceremonies performed in hidden caves at night, blood offerings made to protect the family line from death. According to my mother's own words, she had struck a bargain. Her spirit would never leave this world as long as someone of her bloodline remained to anchor her here. The terror in me grew as I realized what it meant. This wasn't a simple ghost. It wasn't some restless spirit. It was a deliberate pact, a dark contract binding her descendants to her forever. I remembered the words Jacob had muttered so many times in his sleep. She says we have to stay. Forever. Now, everything made horrifying sense. Hidden between the diary's pages were also old newspaper clippings, reports of mysterious disappearances in the area near the house, local farmers speaking of strange lights in the woods, of chants carried on the fog, of children vanishing without a trace. When Sarah saw the evidence, she broke down in tears. She understood, just as I did. It didn't matter how far we ran. The mark of Mrs. Carroll was upon us. And if we didn't find a way to break it, eventually she would find us again. That night, in a cheap motel room in Monroe, with Jacob exhausted and asleep, Sarah and I made a solemn vow. We would never set foot in that house again. We would never speak of it around Jacob, and we would do everything possible to bury that cursed chapter of our lives. But deep inside, I already knew escaping a blood pact wasn't going to be easy. And that whisper at the back of my mind, it wasn't entirely my own. Since that night in Monroe, our lives have never been the same. We left everything behind, the house, our possessions, even the memories we had fought so hard to build. We moved to a small town in Maine where no one knew our story, where we thought we could start over, or so we hoped. For a few months, life seemed normal. Jacob smiled again, playing outside, asking for bedtime stories like he used to. Sarah and I, though still wary, started to breathe a little easier. It was tempting to believe it had all been some terrible dream, brought on by fear and exhaustion. But Jacob's nightmares never left. Almost every night, we would find him sitting up in bed, staring at a dark corner of the room, whispering softly in that old tongue he had never been taught. When we questioned him, he could only recall scraps, speaking of grandma, calling him from the mist, promises he had to keep, a house that waited patiently for his return. We sought help everywhere, therapists, spiritual healers, even priests. They all said the same thing. Jacob was carrying something that wasn't his, a shadow inherited, a blood debt. One afternoon, while organizing the storage room, I stumbled upon a box I didn't remember packing. When I opened it, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Inside was a ragged, dirty cloth doll, identical to the one I had found in the house near Blue Ridge. I had no idea how it got there. I didn't want to know. That night, the wind picked up with unnatural force, and a dense fog blanketed the entire town like a smothering cloak. And amidst the howling wind, drifting between sleep and waking, I heard Mrs. Carroll's voice clearly. "Richard, I never left you." I woke drenched in sweat, my heart pounding against my ribs. Sarah had heard it too. I could see it in her wide, terror-stricken eyes. We didn't say a word. We simply clung to each other like people who know they're running from something that can never truly be defeated. Today, more than 20 years later, we still live with that shadow hovering over us. Jacob, now a grown man, sometimes stares out into the distance, as if still hearing a call the rest of us can't perceive. He never speaks of the house. He never mentions his grandmother. But I know deep inside that bond remains. The old house near Blue Ridge stands abandoned, swallowed by vines and decay. No one dares go near it. Those who do speak of voices in the wind, of shapes glimpsed in shattered windows, of an overwhelming sense of being watched. Maybe we escaped physically, but spiritually I wonder, can anyone ever truly escape a blood curse?